Hi there, glad you're here. Tonight, we're setting off on a quiet stroll through one of history's more misunderstood and rather pungent chapters. It's a tale not of drama and disaster, but of chamber pots, curious remedies, and the many ways people tried and mostly failed to stay clean during the time of the Black Plague. While the bubonic pandemic often steals the spotlight with its dramatic death tolls and grim imagery, tonight we'll focus on something a little more mundane and oddly fascinating: personal hygiene. From vinegar foot baths to perfumed pouches and misunderstood miasmas, we'll explore what it meant to not bathe during one of Europe's darkest and most fragrant centuries. If you enjoy these slow, sleepy dips into the softer side of history, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you some peace and quiet. That really helps the channel if you're into this kind of thing, and I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, with your location and what time you've pressed play. It's always comforting to see how far these cozy stories travel. So now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a little white noise, or snuggle into something soft. Let the hum of a fan or the hush of night keep you company. Breathe in slow, and with that, let's slip into the past together. Let's go back to 1348. The year the Black Death crept into London like a fog no one invited and no one could stop. London at the time wasn't yet the vast imperial city it would later become, but it was already densely packed, profoundly medieval, and almost entirely unprepared for what was coming. If you're picturing cobbled streets, narrow alleys, and precariously leaning buildings, squeezed tightly like a row of rotten teeth, you're not far off. But let's not get distracted by architecture. Tonight, we are talking about hygiene. And hygiene, in the context of Plague-era London, had a particularly pungent reality: waste, human, animal, and otherwise. To understand what hygiene meant in London at the time of the Black Death, you have to begin with a simple question: where did all the filth go? And the boring, unfortunate answer is not very far. Chamber pots were the preferred mode of nocturnal relief for the average Londoner, rich and poor alike. These small, portable bowls allowed people to relieve themselves inside their homes, especially at night, when venturing into the dark streets meant risking robbery, rats, or worse. But these pots were not self-emptying, and there was no formal indoor plumbing. So where did the contents end up? It was completely ordinary and not illegal for someone to simply dump the contents of their chamber pot directly into the street. Customary etiquette asked the dumper to shout a polite "Gardez-le" from their window before tossing the contents, which roughly translates to "watch out for the water." In a twisted mix of French and street wisdom, if you were lucky, you'd hear the warning in time. If not, well, your cloak or headdress might catch something it shouldn't. Streets were sloped for drainage, but this was no sophisticated Roman aqueduct system. Waste of all kinds, human excrement, spoiled food, horse manure, and the occasional dead cat would slowly find its way into the gutters. From there, it would seep into the Thames or stagnate in cesspools that only the bravest or most desperate attempted to maintain. The time, not even out of sight, the stench wasn't just unpleasant. It was considered deadly. The prevailing medical theory of the time was miasma, the idea that disease was spread by bad air or foul smells. The choleric winds, as they were sometimes poetically called, were believed to rise from the rot and decay of the city's unwashed corners, or clasp pomander small, perforated balls filled with spices and resins to their noses. It didn't do much in terms of actually stopping the plague, which spread primarily via fleas and respiratory droplets, but it gave people something to do. And sometimes, especially during a pandemic, doing anything feels better than doing nothing. City authorities weren't completely blind to the issue. As early as the 13th century, London had passed ordinances against dumping waste in public. But enforcing such laws in the maze-like, overcrowded streets was nearly impossible. System of civic responsibility, neighborhood watchfulness, and hired labor. Rakers and gong farmers, two of the more charming job titles in medieval sanitation, were paid to shovel muck out of streets and latrines. Their jobs were not only unpleasant but dangerous, with many suffering from chronic illness due to constant exposure to filth. What's fascinating, and admittedly a bit dull, is how intimately connected every layer of life in Plague-era London was to the control, or lack thereof, of waste. Water sources were often contaminated because human waste ran freely into the Thames and other rivers. Bathing became increasingly rare, not just from the fear of catching cold, but because clean water was hard to come by. Wells were frequently polluted. Even public bathhouses, once popular communal spaces, began to close out of fear that they might spread disease as the Black Plague tightened its grip on the city. Corpses began to appear in the gutters alongside the waste. The line between the living and the dead grew blurry. In places like Eastcheap and Bishopsgate, carts roamed the streets, collecting not only the garbage, but the bodies, too. The cries of "Bring out your dead" and "Gardyloo." Women scrubbed thresholds with vinegar and lye to protect their homes. Children learned to leap over dung piles with the same casual skill they might later apply to hopscotch. People carried on, or that people lived among their own waste, but that such conditions didn't collapse society entirely. That people kept opening shops, marrying, giving birth, praying, and baking bread in a city where you might get splashed by something unspeakable just by stepping outside. It raises the question, how exactly did people keep their health, their sanity, when daily life meant living in a city more filthy than functional? If you lived in Plague-era London and found yourself walking to the market in the early morning hours before the bakers were up, the city's invisible workforce, they worked when others slept, or just as the sun began its slow rise over the sooty rooftops. Their names were not celebrated in song or literature. In fact, most people were glad not to know them at all. But without the rakers, the scavengers, the gong farmers, the city would have quite literally drowned in its own filth. Let's begin with the gong farmers, a term that sounds oddly whimsical until you realize it comes from the word gong, meaning privy. These men were tasked with digging out the contents of cesspits, which were underground chambers designed to catch the waste from latrines and garderobes. Some cesspits were brick-lined, others dug directly into the earth, and all of them eventually needed emptying. The gong farmers would lower themselves into these foul-smelling pits with wooden buckets, long-handled scoops, and thick cloths tied around their faces, not for sanitary reasons, but to make the smell marginally bearable. Once the waste was collected, it had to go somewhere. Gong farmers didn't just dump it anywhere, at least not officially. Instead, they hauled the contents to designated dumping grounds outside the city walls, often working at night to avoid public scorn and the less than pleasant reactions of passersby. The job paid surprisingly well, which was perhaps the only incentive strong enough to convince anyone to do it. Of course, the work came with health risks, social stigma, and, on more than one occasion, death by suffocation or collapse inside a cesspit. It was not a career with a long retirement plan. Then there were the rakers, who served as the city's street cleaners, though that title suggests a degree of modern order that didn't quite exist. Rakers worked with wide shovels and carts, scraping filth from the gutters and alleys and transporting it to temporary waste heaps, known as lastels. These lastels, positioned near the city's gates or on abandoned lots, would accumulate mounds of mixed detritus, human waste, dead animals, rotting produce until a larger cart arrived to take it out to the countryside. There, it might be used as fertilizer on fields, a reminder that even waste had a place in the medieval economy, of course. Wealthier homes had private, small, enclosed spaces that emptied into brick cesspits. Some even had rudimentary drainage systems made of stone or wood. But the poor, they had chamber pots, ditches, and the hope that rain would wash everything away. Alleyways, known as stinking lanes, became informal dumping zones, where refuse piled until it either dried into a crust or was picked apart by dogs, pigs, and the occasional desperate scavenger. Despite all this, London's leaders tried to enforce cleanliness. Ordinances passed by the city's Common Council attempted to regulate everything from the dumping of fish guts in the street to the location of tanners and butchers. These trades were notorious for producing enormous amounts of waste blood, entrails, hair, and hides, scraps often left to rot in the open air. In theory, butchers were supposed to carry their offal to designated areas or dump it into the river only during permitted hours. In practice, enforcement was minimal, and bribery wasn't uncommon. Still, there were glimmers of organized effort. In 1357, just a few years after the worst wave of plague had passed, King Edward III issued a royal proclamation urging Londoners to clean their streets and remove dung heaps. He warned that the corrupt airs rising from the filth would offend not only human noses but also divine ones. Whether the king's concern was more for his own health or the spiritual well-being of his subjects is debatable. But the edict marked an early attempt at urban sanitation reform. Sanitary concerns also touched on water sources, albeit imperfectly. London's water supply came from several streams, wells, and the Thames itself. Wealthier residents had access to the city's conduit system, stone and lead pipes that brought water from cleaner springs outside the city. But even these were vulnerable to contamination. Wells near cesspits often leaked, and many people had no idea that the invisible world of microbes, still centuries away from discovery, was quietly turning water into a vector for disease. Ale and small beer, mildly alcoholic and often safer to drink than water, became everyday staples. Then there's the matter of animals, another key player in the hygiene puzzle. Horses, pigs, and dogs roamed freely. In poorer quarters, pigs functioned like mobile garbage disposals, rooting through refuse for scraps and contributing their own droppings to the chaos. Regulations against letting pigs loose in the streets existed, but again, enforcement was spotty. A pig might be fined for causing a nuisance. Yes, pigs could be fined, but it would take a particularly egregious offense to spark actual removal. For many modern readers, the most shocking realization isn't that cities were dirty, but that people were so used to it. Smell was a constant companion. Residents didn't think of it as a warning sign of disease, they thought of it as London. Children grew up navigating muck-strewn lanes, stepping lightly to avoid the worst spots. Housewives learned to throw ashes over puddles of urine or filth to neutralize the smell. Night soil became part of the daily rhythms, hauled away at sunrise, replaced again by sundown. In a world where no one could see germs or bacteria, cleanliness meant something different. It meant avoiding odors, managing waste just enough to keep it outside your threshold, and perhaps most importantly, maintaining appearances. A tidy doorstep, swept of refuse, was a sign of pride. A clean apron was a badge of self-respect. Hygiene, in that sense, became as much about morality and reputation as it was about health. But for all the rules, rituals, and rakers, London remained. A city teetering on the edge of collapse with every fresh outbreak. And still, people kept living. They adapted to the stench, to the chaos, and to the unending churn of filth beneath their feet. They built lives on top of cesspits, baked bread beside dung heaps, and whispered prayers under the scent of death. Which leads us to the next layer of curiosity. How did the city's obsession with odors give rise to entire industries designed not to clean, but merely to mask the filth? By the time Londoners had grown weary of scrubbing thresholds and dodging chamber pot showers, a new solution to hygiene, least as they imagined, it began to take center stage. Smell, not the absence of bad smell, but the purposeful addition of good smell. In a city where cleanliness was nearly impossible to maintain, an understanding of disease was still based on miasma theory, the idea that foul air bred sickness. People began to think in terms of combat. If the bad air was the enemy, perhaps good air could be the shield. This idea wasn't just a superstition, it was institutionalized. From the royal court to the alleys of Cheapside, the belief that sweet-smelling herbs, oils, and incenses could ward off plague seeped into every level of society. It wasn't unusual to find even the most skeptical Londoner pinning a bundle of dried lavender or rosemary to their cloak, or carrying a cloth soaked in rosewater pressed tightly to the face. When walking through crowded streets, these weren't just decorative touches, they were protective talismans. At least in the minds of those desperate to make sense of the invisible threat creeping through the air. We can't talk about scent and the plague without bringing up the infamous plague doctors, masked, that long-beaked, bird-like contraption that has become iconic in the modern imagination. While these were more common in continental Europe than in England, the idea behind them was universally shared. The beak wasn't a stylistic flourish. It was a filter packed with herbs and aromatic substances such as mint, cloves, or myrrh. Entire neighborhoods, inside homes, people burned incense or set fire to vinegar-soaked cloth. They hung posies in doorways, boiled herbs in pots to scent the air, and even paid perfumers to create special plague-resistant mixtures. Frankincense and benzoin were considered especially potent, and for those who could afford them, the air inside might reek of burning resin long before the sickness ever arrived. And it wasn't just private households. Public institutions tried their hand at scented defense as well. Churches filled the air with thick clouds of incense during Mass, not only for spiritual ambience, but as a kind of airborne armor. In courts and municipal buildings, nosegays, small bouquets of aromatic herbs, were placed on tables or held beneath the nose when speaking. Even prisons, those dens of misery and contagions, sometimes received herbal fumigations, though these were more symbolic gestures than practical defenses. Interestingly, this obsession with odor created its own microeconomy. Apothecaries, spice merchants, and herbalists found themselves in high demand. Recipes for plague repellents circulated widely, some based on traditional herbal knowledge, others invented wholesale by charlatans eager to profit from fear. One popular mixture, known as for thieves' vinegar, combined vinegar with herbs like wormwood, sage, and lavender. Legend held that it was used by a group of thieves who robbed plague victims without falling ill themselves, though whether it worked or not, no one could prove. Scent even influenced clothing. Wealthy individuals might line their gloves with scented balm or wear pomander, small, perforated metal containers filled with perfumes suspended from their belts. These portable perfume globes dangled beside daggers and rosaries, part of a fashionable toolkit for surviving both plague and polite society. For the less affluent, a handkerchief doused in herbs or held near the mouth had to suffice. In the end, the nose became the city's first line of defense. When doctors didn't yet understand bacteria, when water could not be trusted, when soap was scarce, the best hope many people had was to make their world smell just a little less foul. It was a kind of psychological balm, a way to reclaim some control over an uncontrollable reality. If you couldn't kill the disease, perhaps you could confuse it, hide beneath a cloak of lavender, a mask of cloves, or a haze of sweet smoke. Of course, none of it truly worked, not against the plague itself. The real causes were tucked away, in the blood of fleas, in the fur of rats, in the coughs of neighbors. But for centuries, people kept sniffing their way toward survival, treating perfume not just as a luxury, but as medicine, armor, and ritual all rolled into one. And as the worst years of the plague faded, the routines remained. Herbal sachets were passed down through generations. The idea that fresh air was good for the soul, and that foul air was a sign of death, became a quiet cornerstone of English common sense. Even today, traces of this logic linger in our scented soaps, our air fresheners, our fear of musty rooms. So, if you were walking the streets of medieval London during plague season, what might hit you first wouldn't be the sight of the dead, but the peculiar mingling of rot and rosewater city, not only dying, but desperately trying to outsmell death itself. And perhaps that raises the most poignant question of all. Was medieval hygiene truly about cleanliness, or was it simply humanity's stubborn refusal to accept helplessness in the face of death? Before the Black Death arrived in Europe, scent had already carried significant symbolic weight in many societies. Fragrance was sacred, luxurious, and powerful, used to anoint kings, bless altars, and seduce lovers. But when the plague came, that meaning shifted. Perfume ceased to be merely a sign of wealth or devotion. It became a desperate kind of medicine. And in the muddled, rotting world of the mid-14th century. It became a barrier, however flimsy, between survival and despair. Tonight, we trace perfume's unlikely journey, from incense drifting in cathedral aisles to sachets crammed into worn tunics, from royal pomanders of gilded silver to peasant remedies wrapped in linen scraps. This is not a story of sweetness or elegance. It's the story of how a terrified population turned to smell to fight off the invisible, and of how, in the absence of knowledge, fragrance became belief. The earliest origins of plague-era perfume culture were religious. In monasteries across Europe, incense had long been a part of daily ritual. Frankincense and myrrh were not just symbols of holiness, they were, quite literally, tools of purification. Monks believed that these sacred smokes pleased God and cleansed the soul, but they also noticed something else. People felt calmer around incense. In times of disease, that sense of calm was no small gift. When the Black Death began to sweep across Europe in the late 1340s, reaching England by 1348, it spread faster than fear could keep up. Within weeks, people were dying in numbers no one could make sense of. Physicians, many still steeped in Galenic traditions and medieval humoral theory, were wholly unprepared. They blamed planetary alignments, divine wrath, and corrupted air miasma. That idea that foul smells caused sickness wasn't fringe, it was orthodoxy. And so, the logic followed. If bad smells brought death, good ones might bring life. As early as the 1350s, recipes for scented plague remedies were circulating widely. One of the most famous involved soaking cloth in rosewater and vinegar and tying it around the neck or wrist. Others combined camphor, cloves, cinnamon, rosemary, and sage into boiling water, which could then be inhaled as steam or sprinkled in bedding. Merchants in Italian port cities sold packets of dried herbs meant to be burned like incense or carried in leather pouches. In wealthy households, perfumed gloves became both a status symbol and a health precaution. The gloves were soaked in scented oils often derived from ambergris, musk, or civetand, worn throughout the day, their smell serving as a kind of aromatic armor. Ambassadors and courtiers would attend court wearing these fragrant accessories, convinced they were protecting themselves from invisible corruption. Queen Elizabeth I herself, more than a century later, famously received perfumed gloves from dignitaries and praised them for their sweet breath and sanitary function. Among common folk, the resources were humbler, but the ideas the same. Street sellers hawked posies of herbs, lavender, mint, sage, time-tied together with bits of string. These were the same bundles people would later place over their mouths, immortalized in that eerie children's rhyme, ring a ring, oh, roses, ... But the meaning was no nursery song. The herbs were meant to mask the breath of the dying and the smell of mass graves. Many tied them to their belts, pinned them to their hats, or sewed sachets into the lining of their cloaks. Pomandraza, sort of medieval. Diffuser also became more popular during the plague years. Originally carried only by the wealthy, these small, perforated orbs were filled with resins, flowers, and fragrant paste, then hung around the neck or from belts. Some had compartments that could be changed out as herbs lost their potency. They weren't cheap. A well-crafted silver pomander might cost a month's wages for a laborer, but demand didn't stop rising. Fear it turned out, was recession-proof, but not all scents were pleasant. Some remedies relied on strong, pungent odors, the smellier the better. Fumigations, using pitch, sulfur, or even burning feathers, were prescribed by physicians who believed that intense smells could purge the air of its deadly properties. Some recommended bathing in urine or wearing vinegar-soaked rags. Others endorsed boiling vinegar and letting the fumes fill the room. The belief wasn't just that the air should smell different, it had to smell loud enough to overpower death. One of the most enduring recipes of the plague years was the aforementioned 4 thieves' vinegar. According to legend, a group of thieves in Toulouse robbed the homes of plague victims without falling ill. When they were finally caught, they offered to trade their secret in exchange for mercy. The mixture, said to include garlic, rosemary, lavender, sage, and vinegar, was rubbed on the body before entering infected homes. True or not, the story gripped imaginations. Copies of the recipe were passed from town to town, copied into household manuals, and whispered in the alleys of London, Venice, and Paris. Fragrance, then, became something between science and superstition. It was used in salves and soaps, sewn into linens and clothing, burnt in churches, waved in front of faces, and dissolved in boiling water. People turned their entire households into perfumed barricades against a world they couldn't understand. But as more and more turned to scent, something else began to happen, something less often discussed. A strange and subtle social divide emerged, based not just on wealth, but on smell. To smell good meant you could afford protection. To smell bad meant you were vulnerable, exposed, or worse already, infected. Fragrance became not just a barrier against disease, but a symbol of health, privilege, and access. And in a society already fractured by class, those distinctions only deepened the wounds. So, as plague reshaped the economy, the church, and the body count, it also quietly reshaped something far less obvious, the meaning of smell itself. Which leads us to wonder. When fragrance became defense and perfume turned into protection, did medieval people stop smelling good for beauty or for survival? By the middle of the 14th century, perfume had quietly transformed from a luxurious curiosity into something closer to a public necessity, at least for those who could afford it. The theory of miasmathic disease traveled through foul air meant that access to good smells now represented far more than taste or wealth. It became a measure of your chances, and in this new world of perfumed pragmatism, fragrance became a dividing line. If you smelled of cloves and citrus, you were prepared. If you smelled of the streets, you were already half dead. As the Black Plague dragged on, this olfactory hierarchy became more deeply entrenched. Nobles and merchants began amassing ingredients, not for feasts, but for fumigation. A pot, once relegated to the realm of obscure cures and church-supplied herbs, suddenly became pivotal figures in the economy. Their shops overflowed with ingredients once prized only for aesthetic or ceremonial value. Dried lavender, crushed myrrh, camphor oil, cinnamon bark, vinegar steeped with rue and sage. These weren't indulgences anymore, they were medicine. Cabinets, armories, lifelines. One striking example comes from Venice. During the height of the plague, Venetian officials ordered perfumed water to be sprinkled on public streets and the hands of those entering council chambers. In Paris, royal physicians recommended that all homes burn juniper branches daily and perfume their garments with oils. The more scent you wore, the more proactive you appeared. And in a time when power meant survival, appearance was everything. But, with perfume now essential, demand outpaced supply. The ingredients for these oils and balms didn't grow just anywhere. Many were imported: cinnamon from Ceylon, frankincense from Arabia, cloves from the Moluccas. The global trade routes that brought these materials were dangerous and unpredictable, especially in a time of collapsing governments and death-ridden ports. Prices soared, and so scent became yet another luxury, another indicator of social division. This change trickled down to domestic life in interesting, often sad ways. In merchant homes, herbs were hung in doorways, draped over window frames, or sewn into cushions. Cooks were encouraged to add strong-smelling spices to meals, not just for flavor, but to cleanse the air. Linen closets were perfumed with scent, and bedrooms were regularly fumigated with burning rosemary or vinegar steam. In contrast, the poor made do with whatever grew near. Nettles, wormwood, and even onion peels were boiled to produce bitter, nose-stinging vapors that at least felt like resistance. The church, too, adapted. Priests hearing confessions might wear perfumed gloves. Monks disinfected with rosemary water, and funeral rites often included the burning of herbs, not just for sanctity, but for self-preservation. Incense, once used purely for spiritual purposes, now doubled as health policy. Guild of Apothecaries lists dozens of plague preparations, many with poetic or apocalyptic names: the balm of mercy, spirit of camphire, the vinegar of the blessed, St. Luke's scent. These were mixtures of herbs and resins suspended in wine, oil, or vinegar, often absurdly expensive, and almost always ineffective by modern standards. Yet they sold out. Among the general population, the knowledge of how to make such remedies began to spread orally, passed from neighbor to neighbor, family to family. Widow Roberts might have known the best way to steep rose petals in vinegar. Brother John may have discovered that burning thyme on an iron pan produced fewer coughing fits than sulfur. It was folk science, yes, but it was also a kind of shared experiment in survival. Even children became participants. They learned to recognize the scent of wormwood, the difference between bay leaves and marjoram. They were told which smells were safe and which meant death was near. They memorized rhymes not just to pass time, but to remember which herbs went into which pouch. Whole generations grew up believing their safety depended not on the strength of their bodies, but on the sharpness of their noses. Perfume sellers, once mere niche traders, began to operate more like pharmacists. They opened stalls in market squares or posted handwritten lists of what they could supply. Some claimed to have exclusive formulas that had worked in Italy, in Avignon, even in God's own Jerusalem. Others made more dubious promises: powders that glowed when plague was near, oils that made the body invisible to death, pastes to rub on doorposts like some kind of olfactory Passover. Naturally, not everyone believed. Skeptics accused apothecaries of price gouging and selling false hope. There were rumors that perfumed sachets were stuffed not with herbs, but with dried weeds. Some believed perfumers were immune to the plague, not because of their wares, but because they worked in shops so heavily fumigated no germ could survive. Whether true or not, it reinforced the belief that to live in a world of fragrance was to be fortified, and so perfume became politics. City governments distributed herbal pouches to the sick poor not out of real compassion, but to signal order. Hospitals made a point of washing linens with perfumed water. Infected neighborhoods were marked not just with quarantine lines, but with smells, the stench of illness on one street, the scent of vinegar and sage on another. What emerges from all this is a strange, melancholy map of medieval cities where each alley, shop, and parish could be identified not just by its name or location, but by how it smelled. In a way, scent became memory. You remembered a place not by its color or its sound, but by the mixture of rosewater and rot, cloves and corpses. And those who survived often did so in homes soaked in the thick perfume of hope and desperation. But as scent became routine, another question began to surface, one harder to answer. Did people believe these scents truly protected them, or had they simply run out of anything else to believe in? By the late 14th century, the Black Death's initial fury had passed, leaving behind emptied parishes, collapsing economies, and strange new customs that clung to daily life like soot on stone. Among those customs, the use of scent bundles, perfumed gloves, vinegar washes, aromatic oils remained, not only intact, but more deeply embedded than ever. Perfume, in its many forms, had shifted from indulgence to necessity, from superstition to habit, from miracle cure to comfort blanket. And now that the worst had ended, at least temporarily, people were left with something arguably harder than panic: the need to remember. Memory, for plague survivors, wasn't neat or poetic. It lived in the smallest details: the smell of burned rosemary in a shuttered room, the sharp vinegar temps rising from floors scrubbed raw, the heavy sweetness of ambergris that once clung to the gloves of the physician who visited but never returned. Fragrance had become a marker of experience. To walk through London in the 1360s was to be surrounded by an invisible fog of sensory echoes, each one a whisper from the years when death knocked on every door. Yet this wasn't a city obsessed with mourning. Quite the opposite. Survivors were determined to rebuild, and hygiene, such as it was understood, became part of that rebuilding. The use of scent expanded into peacetime life. Town councils began requiring markets and guild halls to be regularly fumigated with herb smoke, not just during outbreaks, but as a matter of civic hygiene. Inns began advertising clean linens scented with lavender or sage. Religious processions waved censers in part to honor saints, but also to sweeten the streets. In some places, smell even began to dictate architecture. Wealthy homes were now designed with ventilation in mind, larger windows, upper floor privacies, even rooms specifically intended for the storage and airing of linens. Some castles added herb rooms for drying and storing perfumed plants. Urban planners began to position cesspits further from wells. Slowly, smell became an index of modernity. The more fragrant your household, the more forward-thinking you appeared. This shift wasn't confined to Europe. Trade routes began to reopen, and along with silk and spices came new fragrances: sandalwood, patchouli, saffron, camphor. The Middle East, long ahead in the art and science of perfumery, began influencing European recipes. Islamic physicians had long used aromatics in medicine. viewing them not as mystical charms, but as effective treatments for respiratory distress, stress, and even infection. These ideas began filtering into European practice quietly, but persistently. Of course, not all responses to scent were hopeful. For some, the smell of perfume remained forever tied to loss. Survivors reported being unable to stand the smell of lavender or vinegar years after the plague had passed. In some cases, families preserved pouches of dried herbs as keepsakes, not for their healing properties, but as relics of the loved ones who had worn them. A child might keep their mother's pomander. A widow might bury a husband with his perfumed gloves. One chronicler from Bruges wrote of visiting a church 20 years after the plague had ended and still smelling the resinous scents of incense. Soaked into the wood, it was, he said, as if the walls themselves remembered. And maybe they did. After all, in a world with few written records and no photographs, scent became a kind of history, wordless, weightless, but profoundly present. What's more, perfume's association with health endured long after the medieval period. The idea that a sweet-smelling person was clean and virtuous would eventually become a cornerstone of modern hygiene culture. In time, soap advertisements would echo medieval logic. Cleanliness equals protection. Fragrance equals health. Even today, products promise to eliminate odors, to refresh, to purify the air, old words in new packaging. And yet, when we trace it back, much of that thinking began in moments of chaos, when terrified people grasped for anything they could control, when washing was impossible, when medicine failed, when prayers went unanswered, perfume remained. It could be worn, made, traded, shared. It was physical, it was immediate, and it smelled like something other than fear. So, while perfume didn't save anyone from the Black Death knot, in the clinical sense, it did something subtler, something maybe just as human. It helped people cope. It offered a ritual, a reason to get up and boil the herbs, a moment to hold a scented cloth to the face and breathe in something other than despair. It allowed people to believe, even if only for a moment, that they had a tool to fight with. And isn't that, in the end, what survival often looks like? Not triumph or certainty, but small, fragrant acts of defiance. So next time you catch the faintest trace of cloves or lavender in a passing breeze, pause for a second and consider this. Are you smelling beauty, or the faintest breath of a world that once used scent to keep itself sane in the face of apocalypse? In the murky alleys and cramped quarters of plague-ridden cities, where rats scurried underfoot and waste trickled down the gutters, there was one place where things got even messier: the barber's chair. But this wasn't your local snipper of beards and mustaches, not just. This was the barber surgeon, a man of the blade who was equally likely to trim your fringe, lance your boil, or amputate your gangrenous toe without anesthetic, of course, and often with the same tools. If you picture a medieval healer as a scholarly physician with delicate instruments and a gentle bedside manner, adjust your expectations. Physicians were rare, expensive, and, in most cases, more likely to diagnose your condition based on your astrological chart than actual symptoms. For the majority of people, especially during times of plague, war, or general squalor, your best chance at medical attention came not from a man in robes, but from a barber with a sharp knife and a basin. And that basin, it wasn't for water. It was for blood. The barber surgeon emerged from the practical needs of medieval society. He was part craftsman, part healer, and part butcher, trained through apprenticeship rather than university. He learned on the job by watching, imitating, and eventually doing. He wasn't taught Galenic theory or humoral balance in Latin. He was taught how to cut quickly and not scream when things squirted. It was gritty, physical work, and in the years of the Black Death, it became vital. Plague boils, also called buboes, formed under the arms, on the neck, and in the groin. They were excruciating, swollen, dark, and often filled with pus. The dominant belief, even among trained physicians, was that lancing the bubo could release the bad humors or poisons from the body. So barber surgeons took to their knives. They would cut open these swellings, sometimes without knowing if it would help, sometimes with full certainty that it wouldn't, but with no better option. After all, once the bubo burst, patients sometimes survived. Sometimes, in theory, lancing was followed by cauterization, burning the wound to seal it and drive out the remaining poison. But in practice, this was haphazard. Hot irons were hard to come by, and cleanliness was more symbolic than actual. Instruments were rarely sterilized. Blades were wiped on aprons. Bowls were rinsed between uses, if at all. Surgeons might move from patient to patient, boil to boil, carrying death beneath their fingernails. Yet despite this, people lined up for treatment. What choice did they have? Pain was everywhere, fear was constant, and even a rough, bloody procedure offered some sense of actions, some sliver of hope. In towns like Avignon, Florence, and London, barber surgeons worked from open stalls, street corners, or the backs of apothecary shops. Their signs were unmistakable: a bowl of blood, a stack of bandages, a line of groaning clients, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a bottle of vinegar to numb the wound or clean the blade. The tools of the trade were few, but grimly effective. Scalpels, bone saws, treffins for drilling into skulls, yes, really, and lances for puncturing abscesses. Some surgeons used leeches to draw bad blood. The knowledge was practical, passed down like family recipes. What mattered wasn't theory, it was whether the patient lived. Still, the barber surgeon had to walk a delicate line. He was not considered a full doctor. He could not prescribe expensive treatments or offer elaborate diagnoses. Who wore long robes, quoted Aristotle, and rarely touched the patient at all. In many cases, physicians offered advice from a safe distance, while barber surgeons did the actual bleeding, blistering. Like London, the barbers took on shaving, tooth pulling, and minor procedures. And of course, plague. The plague years accelerated this fusion. When entire communities fell ill, there simply weren't enough physicians to go around. From secondary infections, they washed wounds when possible and, sometimes, even stitched them. That lancing didn't always help. That some patients died faster after the procedure. That the disease spread to those who handled the dead. But without the language of microbes, without germ theory or microscopes, these observations remained fragmented, speculative, whispered. And still, the barber surgeons worked, because someone had to. And yet, even in this chaotic world of pus and blades, there were rules of a sort. Barbers were expected to be sober, to keep their tools in good condition, to avoid operating on those too far gone. The church watched closely, often forbidding surgery on holy days or on sacred persons and the patients. They watched, too watched with bloodshot eyes as the knife came closer. The red is for blood, the white is for bandages, and the pole itself, a symbol of the staff patients gripped while their veins were opened in public squares. It's a strange memorial, a bright, spinning echo of a time when the man who trimmed your beard might also save your life for end it. But even with all this grit, as the plague raged on, the barber-surgeon's role became less of a trade and more of a performance, public, painful, and oddly ceremonial. These weren't private procedures conducted behind hospital curtains. They were events, sometimes done right in the streets, on wooden stools or crude benches, surrounded by onlookers, whispering prayers or advice no one asked for. In towns where half the population had already perished, based on the ancient idea that the human body was governed by 4 humors blood. If a patient had a fever or showed signs of infection, it was believed they had too much blood. And so out came the knife. The barber would bind the upper arm or leg with a cord or cloth. The blood was collected in a basin, and the flow was often timed. Too much loss could cause fainting or worse. Too little was deemed ineffective. It was a delicate dance of superstition and physiology. Sometimes the patient felt temporary relief, lightheadedness mistaken for healing. But more often, the weakening of the body just hastened decline. Some surgeons favored scarification, scraping the skin with a blade until it bled, then placing leeches to draw out the toxins. Leeches were prized commodities, sold in bundles by herbalists and pond scrapers, and even carried in special wooden boxes. In reality, they simply followed warmth and blood flow. If the bad blood was removed, the body might reset itself. And then came the boils. The buboes of the plague were not subtle things. They swelled rapidly, sometimes within hours, blackening at the edges, hot and hard to the touch. When left alone, they might burst on their own. But barber surgeons didn't wait. They lanced them with iron tools or sharpened wood, draining the pus into rags or bowls. It was messy, dangerous work. The sight of pus leaving the body gave a kind of reassurance, something visible being purged. Vinegar, herbs, or even crushed insects. Some believed the stench of rot could be balanced with the bitterness of wormwood or the burn of mustard seed. Others applied mixtures of ash and urine or rubbed the wound with holy relics. There was no standard protocol. Each barber had his own method handed down from his mentor, who likely got it from someone who'd watched a soldier bleed out on a battlefield. Pain management was primitive. Some barbers offered a strong ale before the procedure, but these were hard to dose correctly and could be as dangerous as the procedure itself. Most patients endured the pain conscious, aware, and desperate. Amputations were another brutal chapter in the barber surgeon's manual. When plague led to gangrene, or when an infected wound festered beyond repair, a limb might be removed to prevent the spread. The process was swift, often done in under 2 minutes. Survival was rare, but not impossible, and those who lived bore their scars as proof of both suffering and endurance. Yet for all this chaos and cruelty, while physicians quoted Galen, prescribed colored syrups, barbers did something, anything. and in an age where entire towns disappeared in days. Even when plague swept through, barber stalls remained open, sometimes with lines snaking around corners. They cut hair, pulled teeth, drained sores, and stitched wounds. And they tried. Behind the Masinzas was a certain logic missy, inconsistent, but not entirely irrational. These were men doing the best they could with what they had. Without microscopes, without antiseptics, without antibiotics or vaccines, they still recognized patterns. They learned to avoid operating on the deeply feverish. They noticed when wounds turned black too quickly. They weren't doctors, but they were observers, improvisers, and often last hopes. Still, their methods and the filth they waded through left us with uncomfortable questions. Could better hygiene have saved more lives? Could boiling their blades or changing cloths more often have prevented further spread? As they wiped the sweat from their foreheads and reached for their next tool, they may have wondered, were they saving lives? As the plague loosened its grip in the late 14th century retreating, and in the quiet between outbreaks, people began to take stock. What had simply looked like healing, and what had actually made a difference. For barber surgeons, the answer was complex. In other ways, they were vessels of chaos, spreading infection with their unwashed tools and contaminated cloths, often making things worse through ignorance. Even as they tried their best to help, still many of their practices survived and evolved. Some even paved the way for real medical progress. Take, for example, wound irrigation. Long before germ theory explained why it mattered, some barbers instinctively poured wine or vinegar over open cuts, not out of modern understanding, but because it seemed to help. Later, this would become the foundation of antiseptic practice. Others insisted on boiling water for cleaning instruments, a rare, labor-intensive habit that may have spared a few lives. These were early glimmers of what would one day become sterile technique. The barber surgeon's observational skills also shaped the next steps in medicine. With no diagnostic tools, they relied on sight, smell, and touch. They noticed that certain wounds festered faster than others, that patients in cleaner environments fared better, that pus of a certain color meant impending death. These weren't scientific theories, they were gut reactions, but they pointed, quietly, toward truths that science would later confirm. The experience of the plague years also accelerated the formalization of surgical training. In cities like Paris and London, barber surgeons began forming guilds and colleges, slowly distancing themselves from their earlier roles as casual street corner practitioners. By the 15th century, the distinction between a surgeon and a barber had begun to solidify. Surgeons petitioned for recognition, for regulation, for exams, and gradually they got them. Yet the public's perception didn't shift overnight. Part necessity, part danger. Many bore the stigma of working with blood and pain. Others were remembered as the only people who dared show up when the noble physicians locked their doors and fled to the countryside. And of course, there were limits to their evolution. Long after the worst of the plague, many barbers still refused to wash their hands between patients. Some still reused rags. Others relied on healing powders made of chalk, charcoal, or ground-up bones. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits were rooted in trauma and improvisation. But perhaps the most lasting contribution of the barber surgeon wasn't their technique or their tools, or even their treatments. It was their attitude. They were not paralyzed by theory. They were not constrained by ceremony. They did what was needed as best they could with what they had. In a world where medicine often meant retreating into books and prayers, the barber surgeon picked up a knife and acted. Sometimes they saved lives. Often they didn't, but they showed up, and even that especially, that meant something, because plague era Europe wasn't looking for perfection. It was looking for presence, for someone willing to sit beside the infected, to lance the boil, to cut the limb, to bear witness to pain when others turned away. And no matter how crude their methods, the barber surgeons did just that. In the centuries that followed, their work would be rewritten, refined, and repainted by history. Eventually, the barber would disappear from the medical equation, and the surgeon would rise clad not in a blood-stained apron, but in a white coat, armed not with poultices but precision. Still, beneath the gloss of modern surgery lies the echo of the man who once carried his blades in a leather satchel, who worked by candlelight, who wiped sweat from his brow while facing down a disease that had no cure. So next time you pass a barber pole spinning silently on a city corner, consider this. Is it simply a relic of grooming, or a quiet tribute to those who first dared to cut, to bleed, and to try when trying meant everything? To understand just how difficult hygiene was during the Black Death, you need only look at a linen shirt, not the silk of the wealthy or the wool of winter coats, but the basic linen undergarment worn by virtually every man, woman, and child in Europe, the one closest to the body, the one designed to soak up sweat, skin oils, fleas, and on more desperate days flecks of blood or plague-spattered pus. And you might wonder, how did people keep it clean? The short answer is, they tried. The long answer is, it was complicated, exhausting, and surprisingly central to survival. In an age without running water, household plumbing, or the concept of laundry day as we know it, washing clothes was a feat of logistics and labor. For ordinary people in plague-era towns and villages, linen was precious. Most owned just a few garments, often rotated until they could no longer be patched. A good linen shift might last a decade. Washing it, though, was a dangerous and difficult ritual, particularly when disease swept through the streets. Let's begin with the basics. Soap, as we think of it today, was a rare luxury in the 14th century. The kind available to ordinary folk was made with lion alkaline, substance created by boiling wood, ash, and water mixed with animal fat. It was rough on fabric and rougher on hands. If you scrubbed too long, your skin would peel. If you didn't scrub long enough, well, you simply weren't clean. And then there was the water. In towns like York, Ghent, or Florence, you might carry buckets from a public fountain or shallow well, or walk to the banks of a river already tainted with waste. During the plague, when it was suspected that water itself could carry disease, many avoided washing altogether. Others doubled down, believing that washing the body and linens could keep the sickness at bay. But the task remained difficult. Drawing water, heating it over an open fire, mixing lye, soaking garments, scrubbing them on stones or wooden boards, it all took hours. Professional laundresses existed, especially in cities, but their work was both respected and reviled. On the one hand, they were trusted with intimate garments. On the other, they were believed by some to spread disease. After all, they handled the dirty linens of the sick. In plague years, this became a moral and practical dilemma. Some laundresses refused to touch plague laundry at all. Others took it, unwrapped their hands in cloth, and boiled everything twice. Many fell ill. Few were thanked. For those doing laundry at home, there were rituals, some useful, some not. Clothes were soaked in vinegar to kill the air. Herbs, like rosemary or thyme, were steeped in the water. Garments were wrung and beaten with wooden paddles, then laid out on hedges or hung from rafters to dry. In rural areas, it wasn't uncommon to see lines of undergarments flapping from tree limbs, their fibers stiff from lye, their smell acrid with ash. But linen wasn't the only concern. Bedding was worse. Feather mattresses and straw pallets became homes for lice and fleas, vectors of plague. Once someone fell ill, the bedding was often burned outright, especially if they died in it. In poorer homes, where replacing a straw tick wasn't so simple, families might boil the linens and hope for the best. Some even slept on bare boards temporarily, preferring splinters to vermin. The church had its say, too. Clean linen was considered a sign of modesty and virtue. Monasteries enforced regular laundering of robes and undergarments. Nuns were tasked with washing not only their own garments, but those of visiting clergy or the poor. There were rules about when and how linen could be washed, and even prayers said over particularly filthy loads. In some orders, the act of washing was considered a form of penance, and it wasn't just cleanliness, it was status. To wear clean linen was to announce that you had the time, the tools, and the help to maintain it. For nobles, this became a subtle arms race. Linen was starched and perfumed, embroidered with family crests, even hidden beneath wool cloaks, just to be felt rather than seen. For commoners, it was a matter of dignity. A clean shirt on a feast day, a scrubbed apron for market, a fresh kerchief for church. These were silent declarations of effort, even amidst filth, of course. Not everyone managed it. Lice were a daily battle. They lived in seams and collars, in bedsheets and hair. Boiling clothes sometimes helped. Hanging them in sunlight helped more. Some stuffed pockets with dried herbs to mask the smell of unwashed fabric. Others simply scratched and endured. Lice combs were sold in markets. Nitpickers, yes, the origin of the phrase, were hired to go through children's heads, plucking out the pests one by one. As the plague crept back in waves through the 15th century, laundry became a frontline defense. Households developed routines. Laundry was kept separate by family member. Washwater was marked with chalk. Cloth was boiled more than once. Some began to burn old clothes entirely, fearing they were cursed or contagious. When entire households perished, neighbors often destroyed the linens rather than inherit them. And still, people laundered, because cleanliness, however rudimentary, was a way to reclaim control. It was one of the few physical acts people could take in the face of a sickness they didn't understand. They couldn't see the plague, they couldn't predict it, but they could light the fire, stir the lye, scrub the cloth, and hang the shirt to dry. It raises a quiet, compelling question. Was all this washing truly about hygiene, or was it a ritual? A hope that maybe by cleaning the cloth closest to your body, you could keep death just a little further from your door. By the time a person in plague-era Europe reached for their shirt in the morning, perhaps still damp from the previous day's wash. They weren't just clothing themselves. They were inviting a hidden population back into contact with their skin, lice, fleas, and the invisible world that fed on filth. While the Black Death may have made its grand entrance with coughing and boils, it rode in quietly on seams and stitches, and more than almost anything else, it was the humble linen shirt that became both shield and saboteur. The relationship between linen and lice was a deeply personal one. Shirts, especially undergarments and bedding, were rarely washed as frequently as needed. Most people only had 1 or 2 shifts. Children wore the same smock until they outgrew it. Washing involved hauling water, boiling it, and hand scrubbing with lion or deal, not easily repeated midweek. And so, lice made themselves at home in collars and cuffs, in the folds of trousers, in the thin creases where cloth met flesh. Barber surgeons and city officials may have dealt with bodies, but laundresses dealt with the living carriers of contagion. They learned to recognize infestations by sight and smell. Clothing that came back crawling had to be dealt with outside. In urban centers like Bruges or York, regulations were passed requiring laundresses to air plague-soiled clothing away from public walkways. Still, the bugs spread. One of the more terrifying realities was that the plague didn't always need rats. Living on black rats research suggests that body lice may also have played a role in its transmission. These tiny parasites lived not in hair, as is commonly believed, but in clothing. They laid eggs in the seams of garments, and when the larvae hatched, they fed on the human host. When people slept, lice burrowed further into fabric and flesh alike. In some plague outbreaks, particularly in cold weather areas with few rats, lice may have carried the disease from person to person through the blood they sucked and shared. But no one in the 14th century knew that. Instead, they responded with routine and ritual. Clothes were sometimes deloused by passing them through smoke or steam. In country homes, garments were placed near the hearth or stuffed with dried herbs, like wormwood and pennyroyal, believed to repel vermin. There were even louse boxes, small wooden containers filled with burning resin meant to fumigate. Clothes hung nearby. Some of these methods worked. Most were just hopeful gestures. Children bore the brunt of it. Nitpicking was a family task. Mothers and older siblings combed through hair, squeezed lice between fingernails, and cleaned combs with vinegar. Infants wore bonnets laced with herbs. Entire market days were dedicated to selling lice combslong, finely spaced tools often carved from bone or wood. A good comb was handed down, shared, and cherished. Losing one meant more than just grooming it, meant exposure. Even the wealthier classes weren't spared. In castles and manor homes, where layers of clothing created extra warmth and extra hiding places for bug servants were often tasked with inspecting seams. Laundry rooms in such places weren't the pastel-tiled spaces we imagine today. They were stone-walled chambers with steaming vats of water, firewood stacked high, and servants wielding heavy paddles. Clothes were scalded, not caressed, and still, no amount of effort could keep lice away forever. The church, too, joined the fight in its own way. Monasteries instituted regular washing of habits and bed linens. Monks were encouraged to bathe occasionally, though not always for hygiene, but to discipline the body through discomfort. Some religious orders treated lice as a form of divine punishment or mortification. Saint Dominic, it was said, wore the same garment for months at a time and offered his itching as a sign of humility. Robes, scrubbing with sand, or wearing wool instead of linen in hopes of discouraging infestations. Interestingly, the idea of airing out garments became widely popular. Even during plague surges, people laid their shirts and sheets across bushes or over lines strung between buildings. Sunlight, though not understood scientifically, was observed to reduce the smell and perhaps the sickness. Some households developed weekly airing days, others hung clothes indoors near fires, and some kept cedarwood boxes for storing garments between wears, hoping the scent would deter bugs. The psychological toll of constant itching and exposure shouldn't be overlooked. Living with lice wasn't just uncomfortably, was exhausting. People scratched themselves raw. Wounds became infected. The shame of infestation added a layer of stigma, especially for women and children. In plague years, when fear already saturated every breath and shadow, even an itch could set panic racing. Was it lice, or the first tingle of plague? Laundry became not just about cleaning, but about containment. The word foul expanded in meaning. It didn't just describe smell or filth, but danger. A foul shirt might bring death. A fouled bed could doom a whole family. Entire households burned their linens after an illness. In cities, piles of plague laundry were dumped in rivers or buried with the dead. Some towns paid washerwomen double to clean such loads. Others simply refused them. And still, people washed with red hands and boiling pots, with burned fingertips and vinegar rags. They washed to soothe, to sanitize, and to silence the itch that whispered, "You're not alone." Leaves us wondering, when linen became the front line and lice the enemy, did people keep laundering because it worked, or because it was the only war they could still fight with their own two hands? As the Black Death continued its grim march across medieval Europe, a subtle shift began to take place in the collective imagination. Linen, so long the quiet companion of daily life, was no longer seen merely as clothing or bedding. It had become something else entirely, a suspect, a possible killer, and in some strange way, a final defense. Everywhere the plague went, fabric followed. Deathbeds soaked in sweat and blood were stripped of their linens and burned. The garments of the deceased were gathered in carts and destroyed by fire or buried in deep pits with lime. Confiscation of plague-stricken bedding. The logic was clear. Cloth held the smell of sickness, and in a world governed by miasma and uncertainty, smell was danger. By the 1360s, there was growing awareness without germ theory that dirty fabric could carry death. Yersinia pestis. People had begun connecting exposure to contaminated linens with the spread of illness. Laws were written. Ordinances passed. In Paris, anyone caught selling second-hand garments from a plague house could be fined or imprisoned. In Venice, plague hospitals stored the clothing of the sick in separate buildings, fumigated with burning sulfur and vinegar vapor. But enforcement wasn't always consistent. Poverty made reuse necessary. In rural villages, hand-me-downs were a lifeline. Blankets too thin to boil were merely aired out and passed along. Children inherited clothes from siblings who had died. Entire households slept on straw pallets made of cloth torn from the garments of the dead. It was not ignorance, it was survival. The fear of fabric became so intense in some cities that it altered funeral customs. Traditionally, a deceased person would be wrapped in a clean shroud, sometimes made by hand, sometimes repurposed from household linens. But during plague outbreaks, this ritual was abandoned. Bodies were buried in whatever they died in, or naked, or covered only with quicklime. Shrouds were deemed too dangerous. In some towns, they were banned from working. In others, they were recruited by city officials and sent into plague houses to retrieve and cleanse garments of the ill. Few agreed willingly. Some demanded triple pay or protective blessings. They boiled garments in vats of vinegar and lye, dried them in smokehouses, scrubbed until their knuckles bled. Many died, others vanished into city outskirts, refusing to return. Their absence was a quiet loss, another hole in a fraying social fabric. And yet, amidst the destruction, laundering persisted, not just as sanitation, but as symbolism. In monasteries, clean habits were laid out on altars as offerings. In homes, freshly washed linen was hung prominently in windows, not only to dry, but to display, "We are clean, we are not yet touched." Some towns declared communal washing days, where neighbors gathered to boil and beat garments, chanting prayers over the steam as if their hope might rise with it. The act of washing, increasingly, came to stand in for something bigger than itself. It was order against chaos, discipline against despair, a reminder that the body still mattered, that even if death couldn't be stopped, it could be met in clean clothes. In some plague chronicles, survivors wrote not just about who died, but about what they wore when they died. A clean shirt was a kind of defiance. Interestingly, this intense relationship with fabric had long-term effects. In the centuries following the plague, laundry took on new meaning in Europe. Clean linen came to represent not only hygiene, but morality. The phrase spotless reputation gained weight. Public washhouses, once informal gatherings along riverbanks, became institutionalized. Cities built lavoirs, shared laundry halls, where women could wash in flowing water. Rules were enforced, hours were scheduled, and in many places, a hierarchy of cleanliness emerged. By the 16th century, aristocrats prided themselves on linen more than wool. Servants were assigned solely to manage household washing. Laundry lists became part of estate inventories. The very act of wearing clean linen is, specially visibly, like a ruffled shirt collar or a bleached apron, became a sign of wealth, virtue, and health. But all of that stemmed from a time when scrubbing a hem felt like protection, when hanging a shirt in the sun felt like resistance, when burning your bedding meant survival. So the next time you throw your clothes in a machine and walk away, consider the long, heavy lineage behind that simple act. The boiling pots, the red lye burns, the lice combs and vinegar, the fear, the stubborn hope. Because at the height of the Black Death, when entire towns were being swallowed by disease and despair, a woman somewhere still stirred the laundry vat, stared into the steam, and thought, if I can clean this cloth, maybe I can cleanse away what's coming. The plague didn't just spread through back alleys and crowded markets. It arrived quietly, by ship. A handful of sailors coughing in the hold, a cargo of cloth from a city already gripped by death. A merchant, too pale, too warm, too eager to disembark. For centuries, ports were the lungs through which plague breathed coastal. Gateways that connected trade, travel, and, unfortunately, transmission. And it was at one of these gateways, Ragusa, now known as Dubrovnik, that a strange idea took root. Maybe, just maybe, you could stop disease by stopping people. It was here, in this Adriatic port city, that the first official policy of 40 giorni 40 days was born. In 1377, amid recurring waves of plague, Ragusan authorities declared that all newcomers arriving from infected cities must remain outside the city walls for 40 days. They weren't to touch citizens, enter the market, or deliver goods. They were to wait, isolated in designated spots outside the city, most often on nearby islands or in remote lodging houses. If they showed no signs of illness after 40 days, they were allowed to enter. If they did well, they didn't enter at all. And so, quarantine was born not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a logistical compromise between commerce and survival. Ragusa couldn't afford to shut its port entirely. Trade was its lifeblood. But it also couldn't afford to let plague in again. The solution: delay, not prevention. Exactly, more like enforced hesitation. These first quarantines were crude. Sailors and travelers were lodged in stone huts or wooden shelters, often built hastily on nearby islets, like lock. Supplies were delivered by boat and left at a distance. Communication was done through shouted conversation or signals. The confined were not criminals, but they were treated as suspect. No hugs, no handshakes, no exceptions. What's often forgotten is that these quarantine spaces weren't just places of medical waiting. They were ecosystems of anxiety. Imagine 40 days, no clocks, no newspapers, no certainty, just the sound of waves, the creak of ropes, the murmurs of others, stuck in the same limbo. Most brought their own food, but fresh water was a problem. Lice and fleas thrived in close quarters. Bedding wasn't always clean. Medical inspection was cursory at best. A man might arrive healthy and fall ill by day 10, at which point panic would ripple through the entire camp. Authorities tried to manage these spaces, but resources were limited. Guards patrolled the borders, often more interested in bribes than safety. Monks and physicians occasionally visited, wearing scented cloths around their mouths. In some cases, those confined were left to govern themselves, setting up informal rules: who slept where, how food was shared, how to deal with the sick. These proto-communities, formed in fear and boredom, reflected both the ingenuity and fragility of life under forced separation. But for all its flaws, Ragusa's quarantine worked better than most measures of the time. Other ports took notice. Venice soon adopted a similar model, establishing its first Lazaretto, a plague hospital and isolation ward on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth. Genoa, Marseille, and Pisa followed. Quarantine stations became part of the maritime landscape. Some were simple shacks. Others evolved into fortified complexes with guard towers, kitchens, examination rooms, and chapels. The wealthy sometimes secured private lodgings. The poor were packed into barracks. Cleanliness was a concern, but not in the way we might expect. The focus wasn't on sterilization or microbial hygiene. It was on separation, on keeping the potentially infected from the certainly healthy. Linen was aired, not boiled. Surfaces were scrubbed with vinegar or ash. Windows were left open too, let in the cleansing wind. Ships themselves were sometimes fumigated with burning herbs before unloading. And yet, even in these environments of isolation and suspicion, people tried to keep a semblance of dignity. Sailors washed themselves in buckets of seawater. Merchants hung their cloaks in the sun. Women combed their hair, even as they worried about lice. Personal rituals, scrubbing shoes with vinegar, shaking out sleeves 3 times before dressing, placing cloves in the mouth before speaking offered a sliver of control. For those inside the walls of Ragusa, the system was both a relief and a disruption. It meant fewer funerals, fewer nights of fevered coughing. But it also meant delayed shipments, missing relatives, business lost to ports without such rules. Some grumbled that the plague was overblown, that the waiting was unjust, that the city was being too cautious. Others whispered about people sneaking past the guards, bribing their way inside. Every coughing merchant became a debate. Still, the practice held. Over time, it evolved. 40 days became a standard across much of Europe, regardless of scientific backing. Why 40? No one knows exactly. It held biblical significance. 40 days of flood, 40 days in the desert, 40 days of Lent. But it also roughly matched the incubation periods for many diseases. Whether by divine coincidence or rough medical instinct, it worked. And perhaps, most striking of all, people complied. They waited. They watched the city they had come to trade with or return to just beyond reach. They lit fires, sang songs, told stories, prayed. They passed time however they could, because the hope was simple, that one day the guards would wave them forward, that the gates would open, and that they could walk in clean, healthy, whole. And yet, some never made it through the 40 days. Which leads us to a haunting thought. Did quarantine save the living? Or did it merely delay death until it arrived in a more orderly fashion? By the time quarantine became routine in Ragusa and spread across other Mediterranean ports, it was no longer just a bold idea, had become a logistical operation, a system of containment, transportation, and grim negotiation with nature itself. Keeping people separated for 40 days sounds manageable in theory. In practice, it meant creating whole temporary societies on scraps of rock, strips of land, and hastily constructed compounds just beyond the reach of the city's protective walls. The most notorious of these were the lazarettos, from the name of Saint Lazarus, the patron saint of lepers. In many cities, the term referred not only to the physical structure, but to the state of being exiled, observed, and half forgotten. These weren't hospitals in any modern sense. They were holding pens, way stations, spaces not meant for comfort, but for risk management. The first lazaretto in Venice, founded in 1423 on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, became the model for others. It included dormitories, kitchens, storehouses, and open courtyards for airing goods. It also had high walls, watchtowers, and guards. Plague goods, textiles, furs, bales of cotton were unbundled, aired, and sometimes smoked with sulfur. The belief was that disease clung to fabric, hiding in the folds like a thief. The sick were placed in separate quarters, or, if their symptoms were severe, left alone with only bread and water, their fate to be watched from a distance. Ragusa's version was more makeshift in its early years. The city had few islands close, enough for daily supervision, but distant enough to prevent contagion. Some unlucky travelers were simply marooned, left with food, water, and little else. Others were kept in remote barns or huts along the coastline. Sailors remained aboard their ships, forced to live within creaking holes for weeks, forbidden to dock. These floating quarantines, while effective at separation, were breeding grounds for frustration, lice, and sometimes violence. Supplies posed a constant problem. Who brought food to the confined? Who removed their waste? Who carried messages, tended wounds, or checked for fevers? The answer, often, was those who had no choice: poor laborers, convicts, monks. In Venice, criminals sometimes had their sentences commuted in exchange for weeks of service on the quarantine islands. They rowed boats, carried goods, buried the dead. In Ragusa, volunteers were rare. Many tasks fell to city-employed porters who worked behind vinegar-soaked cloths, paid extra to handle packages and linens from suspect ships. These workers weren't always reliable. Corruption was rife. Guards might be bribed to deliver messages, smuggle food, or even allow a secret visit between quarantined lovers. In one account from Marseille, a merchant reportedly disguised himself as a fisherman, rowed ashore under cover of night, and entered the city unchecked. His presence sparked a small outbreak and an enormous manhunt. Fear lived not only within the quarantine zones, but beyond them. Cities posted daily bulletins about who had arrived, how long they had been held, and when they would be released. Church bells rang if someone died during isolation. Families gathered at the edge of quarantine lines, shouting messages or waving handkerchiefs dipped in vinegar, ritual gestures that meant, "We are thinking of you. We hope you are still alive." Inside the quarantine, time was its own disease. With no work, no travel, and no entertainment, people turned inward. Sailors carved wood. Merchants wrote letters they couldn't send. Some played games with pebbles or practiced memory drills, reciting long verses aloud just to stay sharp. Others deteriorated. Anxiety wore down the mind. Minor symptoms became panic. A cough meant doom. A headache meant the beginning of the end. People began reporting false symptoms out of fear or hiding real ones in hopes of escaping the 40 days early. The tension between surveillance and survival shaped the entire experience. Guards checked for rashes, sniffed for fevered breath, counted coughs. If anyone fell ill, their companions were re-quarantined another 40 days. One misstep could mean weeks lost. Families fought, tempers flared, food ran low, water grew stale. And always, just on the horizon, the city loomed so close, so clean, so unreachable. Hygiene, as practiced in quarantine, was half science and half ritual. Clothes were beaten with paddles, hung over ropes, smoked over fires. Herbs were boiled in vats and used to wash hands. Vinegar was the universal tonic, rubbed on skin, poured over packages, even gargled. Boats arriving with goods were ordered to carry extra ropes so barrels could be unloaded without touching dock workers. Wooden crates were pried open with sticks. Sometimes it arrived hidden in a bundle of wool. Sometimes in the skin of a sailor who showed no symptoms until day 38. Sometimes it rode the wind itself, so people believed. Blame fell hard. Doctors were accused of misconduct. Guards were beaten because, imperfect as it was, it worked better than nothing. It bought time. It slowed the tide. It gave cities a sense of control. But for those who waited, those who watched from behind fences and island rocks, it created a strange memory, not of sickness exactly, but of separation, of being alive and yet not quite part of the living. And it makes you wonder, was quarantine truly about health? Or was it about drawing a line, not just between sickness and wellness, but between us and them? Endured it when others had not been so fortunate. In this way, quarantine wasn't just a health policy, it was a rite of passage, and one that left visible and invisible marks. If you were cleared after your 40 days, you didn't simply walk back into town. In many ports, you were issued a certificate, an early version of a health passport. This document, often bearing the city's seal and the name of a physician or port official, attested that you had shown no signs of plague. Glimpse something deeper. Clean didn't just mean uninfected. It meant trustworthy, acceptable, safe to touch again. But being declared clean didn't always erase the stain of having been unclean. Quarantine survivors returned to homes and families with a strange new aura. Neighbors might avoid them in the market. Rumors swirled. Had they really made it 40 days? Were they hiding symptoms? Were they cursed by the time away? This social residue, the lasting suspicion, was hard to wash away, even with vinegar and prayer. Merchants, in particular, bore the brunt of post-quarantine prejudice. If you were a trader who had spent 40 days on a rocky island, your goods might now be viewed with unease. Cloth might be refused. Spice might be rejected. Some traders resorted to marking their wares with elaborate signatures or seals to prove they had been aired, scrubbed, and left untouched for weeks. Still, many faced losses. Some ports even imposed additional duties on goods brought in post-quarantine, as if disease lingered in fabric longer than in flesh. The emotional toll, too, was slow to fade. Chroniclers speak of sailors who developed a kind of listlessness after isolation, of families who never quite adjusted to being reunited, of lovers who grew distant. With every new voyage came a new cycle of separation. Europe, cities published official quarantine statutes. Whole professions emerged to serve the quarantined. Cooks, carriers, inspectors, laundry workers. New languages developed to describe the process: fumigation, ventilation, disinfection. And while science had not yet caught up, bureaucracy certainly had. Interestingly, the concept of cleanliness also began to evolve. It wasn't just about physical purity anymore. It was bureaucratic, verified, paper-based. Cleanliness became something that could be certified, stamped, and denied. And so, for the first time, over the decades, it refined its system, expanded its isolation zones, and trained officials to better manage arrivals. The city's willingness to confront plague with something more than prayer became a source of civic identity. Other cities took note. By the 17th century, quarantine had become not just a health measure, but a symbol of state authority and organization. Ports that didn't have a quarantine system were seen as backward, unsafe, unclean, but beneath the paperwork and the guard towers, the human cost endured. Quarantine never felt like safety to those who lived it. It felt like waiting, like punishment for the crime of proximity. like the slow erosion of certainty day after day of silence and the ticking clock of symptoms that might or might not arrive. And when you stepped back into the city, dressed in clothes that had been aired for weeks, skin scrubbed with lye, hands dry from vinegar, the question lingered, was this the price of safety? Or just a softer, more civil way of saying, we feared you might be contagious, and we still do. Even today, the echoes of Ragusa's decision ripple through our world. In every health screening at a border, in every quarantine hotel, in every paper slip declaring you negative, there's a whisper of that rocky Adriatic outpost and its bold idea that perhaps the best way to protect the many was to hold back the few, even if the few had already done nothing wrong. Because in the end, quarantine wasn't just about stopping the plague, it was about drawing a boundary between fear and hope, and trying, however imperfectly, to keep them from touching, hidden behind thick stone walls and cloistered gardens. Medieval monasteries offered a strange paradox in times of plague. They were both sanctuaries and hotspots, places of prayer and places of contagion. Too many in plague-era Europe, these religious houses stood as bastions of purity, spiritually clean, disciplined, protected by divine favor. And yet, as the Black Death swept through cities and countryside alike, monasteries found themselves not immune but uniquely vulnerable. And as it turns out, and spiritual contamination with hygiene practices that were as much about faith as they were about cleanliness to begin with. Pilgrims housing the sick, providing food and charity to surrounding towns. Monks shared dormitories, meals, and chapels. And while abbots enforced rules of silence, fasting, and prayer, disease respected none of them. The outbreak of plague in the 14th century confronted monastic communities with a crisis unlike any they had known. Their strict routines, once thought to protect body and soul, suddenly became liabilities. Shared chalices during Mass, communal sleeping arrangements, group chanting in close quarters, all these were now vectors, though no one yet had the vocabulary to say so. Still, monasteries reacted in the only way they knew, through discipline and ritual. Holy water became the first line of defense. It was sprinkled liberally, not just during services, but over bedding, doorways, and even the hands of visiting peasants. Monks believed it purified the soul, but they also believed it warded off illness. Some kept small vials of it by their beds. Others dipped their fingers before eating, a kind of spiritual sterilization. But the water, drawn from wells or fonts rarely cleaned, likely did more to spread disease than stop it. Incense, too, filled the air. Thuribles swung with greater frequency during plague years, their sweet smoke meant to drive out demonic air. In abbey churches, the scent of burning frankincense and myrrh blended with the less pleasant smells of unwashed robes and ailing bodies. Defense. Monks stuffed herbs into their sleeves, burned juniper near their dormitories, and hung posies over doors. When a brother showed signs of illness, the reaction was part ritual, part practicality. He was removed from the dormitory and taken to the infirmary, a wing that, ironically, often lacked proper ventilation. Here, he was prayed over, bled, and offered herbal tonics by the monastery's physician or apothecary, did so in shifts, wearing vinegar-soaked cloths over their faces and washing their hands with herbal tinctures, but no gloves. Despite this, monks clung to their routines. They rose before dawn, washed in cold water, available and gathered from matins. Washing was not about sanitation, it was about humility. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most Western monastic life, prescribed hand-washing before meals, face-washing before prayers, and weekly bathing for the infirm. But bathing often meant wiping down with a damp cloth. Monks were expected to own only a few robes and share washing duties. In wealthier monasteries, lay brothers or hired women managed the linens. In smaller houses, monks themselves boiled water over fires, scrubbed cloth on stone slabs, and dried garments on hedges. The combination of damp, communal living and infrequent washing made lice a regular companion. Knit combs circulated quietly. Itching was endured without complaint. To scratch too often was seen as vanity. More devout communities interpreted the plague not as a test of hygiene, but as a punishment for sin, in penance, or slept on bare boards instead of mattresses. In these houses, sickness wasn't something to avoid, was something to offer up. The dying were tended to with hymns, not herbs. Wounds were kissed. Boils were seen as divine trials. It was piety wrapped in danger, and yet not all were so. Resigned. Some monasteries attempted to enforce stricter hygiene protocols. Water supplies were checked more often. Separate cloisters were designated for newcomers. Monks who handled corpses were sometimes quarantined. Cloaks were aired in sunlight. Woven mats were beaten. Beds were assigned farther apart. Even so, entire communities disappeared. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were left empty within. Weeks victims not of neglect, but of devotion. These empty houses became haunting relics. Birds nested in chapel rafters. Overgrown gardens bloomed beside abandoned cloisters. And in places like Yorkshire, Provence, and Umbria, peasants told stories of monks who had continued chanting their psalms long after the last of them had fallen ill, their voices echoing through the nave until only silence remained. So what did it mean to be clean in such a place? Not scrubbed and sterile, surely, not safe from plague, but clean in the eyes of God, clean in intention, clean in the sense that every morning monks woke, washed their hands, lit incense, and faced death with robes slightly stained, but souls, at least in their minds, unblemished. And maybe that's why these rituals endured, Devon, when they failed. Because they gave shape to fear. They turned chaos into routine. But one can't help but wonder if monasteries believed so deeply in spiritual cleanliness. Why did their walls so often reek of death? Was it piety that failed them, or their idea of what it meant to be truly clean? By the mid-14th century, as the Black Death continued to strike in wave after wave, monastic communities across Europe began to find themselves in a deep and growing contradiction. Sick and dying, stewards of both spiritual and physical healing. And yet, in daily contact with suffering, they were powerless, or at least mostly powerless. Monks and nuns had long served as the primary caretakers of the sick, in an age where physicians were few, expensive, and mostly confined to cities. Monasteries offered care that was, if not effective, at least consistent. Many housed infirmaries, tended herb gardens, and employed apothecaries trained in both Galenic medicine and local folklore. They bled patients, they mixed salves, they brewed teas and tonics from sage, rue, and mint. They copied medical manuscripts by hand and studied them by candlelight. And yet, when the plague arrived, their practices, so orderly and scholarly, on paper proved hollow in practice. Let's begin with the infirmaries themselves. These were usually small, shared rooms adjacent to the main cloister. Beds lined the walls. More, there was little ventilation, little separation. When one monk fell ill, the rest of the ward was often next. Attempts at quarantine were minimal, and when they were enacted, they were crude. The sick were moved to outer buildings, if such existed, or placed in cordoned-off corners. Bedding was sometimes burned, sometimes not. Used robes were laundered. If water was available, but soap made from ash and animal fat was often in short supply, the medicines, too, were a blend of earnest effort and misplaced faith. The monks knew their herbs. Many were expert botanists, but they lacked the diagnostic tools to distinguish plague from fever, from dysentery, from simple exhaustion. Bleeding remained common. The wound might be sprinkled with ground sage or garlic paste, then wrapped in linen washed, or not, depending on availability and belief. Many monks believed, sincerely, that certain holy relics could heal: a drop of water from a saint's shrine, a splinter from the true cross, the hair of a martyr. These were administered not in opposition to medicine, but alongside itas, if a double layer of defense, half herbal, half heavenly. And when the treatments failed, as they often did, monks saw it not as a failure of method, but a test of faith, or worse, a divine punishment. This mindset became particularly dangerous in the later plague waves. As desperation mounted, rituals intensified. Some monks began flagellating themselves, publicly beating their own backs in a display of repentance. Others fasted to the point of collapse. Some secluded themselves entirely, refusing to eat or speak, believing that only silence and suffering could cleanse the monastery of its invisible sin. Still others sought out the dying, tending them with an almost reckless devotion, hoping perhaps that dying in service would grant them eternal favor. Yet beneath the piety, practical needs festered. Who would clean the chamber pots, boil the linens? Who would tend the gardens when half the community was ill and the other half too afraid? In many cases, labros, the non-ordained men who handled the dirty work, shouldered these burdens. But when they too fell sick, they hired outsiders to bury the dead, paying them in silver or food. They relaxed their rules about fasting and prayer. Some allowed prayers to be said in individual cells rather than group chapels. One abbey in Burgundy went so far as to divide its monks into two groups, cleansed and unclean, based on proximity to the sick. The unclean were banned from common meals, forbidden from touching sacred items, and had to wash daily with vinegar. It was a crude caste system, born of fear. Hygiene, as we think of it now, was never the goal in these measures. Cleanliness meant ceremonial purity, washing the hands before Mass, changing into a fresh robe before reading the Psalms, scrubbing the altar table, but cleaning to remove disease. It was that their understanding of dirt, sickness, and purity was shaped by scripture and tradition, not microbes. Still, we see glimpses of evolution. Some monasteries began boiling water for hand washing, a practice borrowed from Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Others stored vinegar and rosemary in small glass vessels, using them to wipe down benches and doorknobs. A few even designated tools, scissors, knives, cups for exclusive use by the sick. These were not systemic reforms. They were fragments, instincts, hints of a more modern sense of sanitation. Meanwhile, changed. Parishioners, once comforted by the sight of black-robed monks, now turned wary. Had they seen too much death? Were they blessed or cursed? In towns where the monastery suffered high losses, it was seen as a sign that no one, not even the holiest, was safe. In other places, monks were blamed for spreading the disease, for failing to prevent it, for trusting in rituals that clearly hadn't worked. And inside the cloister, those who survived had to grapple with the bitter realization that their routines, their chants, their daily washing and praying of spirit had not guaranteed cleanliness of body. And perhaps that was the most painful truth of all. If God's own servants could not keep their robes clean of disease, then what hope was there for the rest of the world? Those who remained were changed, not just older, not just fewer, but reshaped by an encounter with mortality that had pierced every chant. And in the aftermath, the notion of what it meant to be clean within the cloister shifted. It had to, because, when the plague came, it hadn't spared the pious. It had soaked into their sacred spaces, crept into their manuscripts, clung to their robes, and it had left behind the scent, not of incense, but of rot. Death in a monastery had always been ritualized. His hands were washed, his feet anointed, psalms were recited, candles lit. The community sang him into the next life. There were too many bodies, too few hands. Instead of prayers, there were hurried wrappings. Instead of candles, darkness. Instead of burial in the monastery yard, mass graves hastily dug beyond the walls. Many abbots struggled with this. The rule of Saint Benedict taught that each monk was to be treated with dignity, even in death. But now, bodies were burned, linens incinerated, cells sealed and abandoned. The fear of contamination overrode the call to compassion. In some houses, monks refused to touch the dead. In others, they washed the bodies with vinegar and wept as they did. In a few, the last healthy brother rang the chapel bell alone, then lay down in his cell to await his own end. The communal nature of monastic life, which had once been its strength, had become its vulnerability. Shared meals, shared books, shared beds had created an environment ideal for spiritual unity, and equally ideal for disease transmission. Some monasteries began to adapt. New dormitories were built with individual cells. Washing became more frequent, especially before communal prayer. Staff. The idea that physical separation might prevent spiritual ruin began to gain ground, and with these changes came questions, quiet ones at first, then louder. What was the purpose of ritual if it could not protect? Was incense merely perfume? Was holy water just water? Did cleanliness of soul matter if the body was unwashed, infected, dying? For some monks, the answer was to double down, to fast more strictly, to pray more fervently, to flagellate harder, to renounce even the small pleasures of warm food or woolen robes. For others, it meant embracing practical reforms, boiling linens, quarantining the sick, insisting on clean hands before entering the chapel. A few even began to correspond with physicians and scholars outside the cloister, asking questions they had never dared ask before. A strange synthesis began to emerge, a mingling of the spiritual and the practical. Herb gardens, once tended for flavor, were now organized with medicinal logic. Washing which had always been symbolic, now became routine. And slowly, a new kind of cleanliness took hold, one that served both body and soul. But these changes were uneven, and not every monastery adapted. Many remained locked in their ways, insisting that plague was a test, not a contagion. Others simply lacked the numbers to rebuild, were left with echoing silences in chapels that once hummed with morning chants. And yet, the memory of those years endured. In surviving monasteries, chronicles were written. Monks recorded not just who died, but how, what they had worn, what was burned, what was saved, nor hands to tend them. The silence was not holy, it was hollow. A list of herbs boiled for fever, a note about the safest way to clean a crucifix touched by a dying brother, an entry recording that, at last, the well had been emptied and scrubbed with lye. Those were not grand theological revelations. They were the mundane minutiae of survival, and they mattered. In the centuries to follow, monastic communities would become unlikely guardians of public health. They pioneered early hospital design. They trained apothecaries. They wrote manuals on cleanliness, not just of the soul, but of skin, air, and cloth. They had learned, painfully, that spiritual purity and physical sanitation were not enemies, they were allies. And perhaps that is the most lasting lesson of all, because when we picture plague-era monasteries, we often imagine only death, but woven into the shadows were also habits of care, quiet routines, buckets of boiling water, grief still wringing out a robe in the cold morning light. And so, in the end, we ask, was it ritual that kept them going? Or the simple, stubborn act of scrubbing a floor no one would ever see clean again? In the great catalogue of blame compiled during the years of the Black Death, few suspects endured with more lasting infamy than the rat. Small, nimble, and ever-present, the humble black rat, Rattus rattus, scurried into the annals of history, not just as a background nuisance, but as an emblem of contagion. And while modern science would later assign the true villain's role to the flea, it's undeniable that without the rat's unwitting cooperation, yet a household enemy, it was a nuisance. Yes, it chewed through grain sacks, gnawed at wood beams, and occasionally startled someone in the cellar. But it wasn't associated with disease. People had lived alongside rats for centuries in the crowded towns and cities that burst into chaotic growth during the late medieval period, and refuse that sustained the poor. And what a feast that refuse offered. Medieval cities were dreamscapes of rot and waste. Streets doubled as sewers. Butchers dumped entrails outside their stalls, emptied into gutters. Dead animals were tossed behind sheds or down embankments. In such places, rats thrived. Wherever humans went, rats followed. The relationship was symbiotic in its grime. Rats feasted on human waste. Cats, the natural predator of rats, were themselves caught in a web of superstitions, sometimes revered, sometimes reviled, even slaughtered during religious purges, allowing rat populations to boom in their absence. The result, by the 1340s, when plague crept westward across the Silk Road, rats were not just present in Europe, they were everywhere. Still, no one saw them as harbingers of death, to air, to water, to divine punishment. Disease was too holy, too mysterious, too human. Meanwhile, rats kept scurrying, but science, centuries later, would catch up. It is now widely accepted that the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis was spread primarily through flies, specifically the oriental rat flea Xenopsilla chiapis, which lived on the black rat and occasionally, under certain conditions, jumped to humans. These fleas, once infected, could transmit the bacteria through their bites. When a rat died, suddenly its body, overwhelmed by the very bacterium it carried, its fleas sought a new host. They carried the fleas from alley to granary, from dock to attic, from one ship's hold to another. And when infected ships arrived in ports like Messina, Genoa, and Marseille, they didn't need to bring infected humans, all alive with the potential for death. When rats began dying in droves, sometimes literally falling from rafters, people did not understand their significance. In fact, during the height of the plague, rat deaths may have preceded human deaths by days or weeks in certain areas. The silence of a barn that once rustled, the empty granary, weren't recognized as warnings. Rats didn't feature heavily in the contemporary chronicles. The chroniclers focused on bodies, on priests refusing burials, on carts overflowing with corpses, on the terrible stench, on the silence. Of the rat's story isn't how it caused so much death, but how long it took people to notice. For centuries, the rodent went unnamed in the annals of blame. To connect the dots between fleas, rats, even then, the theory was controversial, and still today there are debates. Some researchers suggest human fleas and lice played a larger role than once thought. Others believe different strains of Y. pestis traveled through respiratory droplets, rather than via flea bite. But whatever the precise combination of vectors, one thing is clear. Rats were not just bystanders. They were central to the story. And they were central because of what humans had built. Cities teeming with waste, homes packed tight with flammable straw, stores overflowing with food and filth. Rats didn't create these conditions. By the time black rats had firmly rooted themselves in the infrastructure of medieval Europe, gnawing rafters, nesting in sacks, scuttling over sleeping heads, they're tiny. If the rat was the carriage, the flea was the assassin tucked beneath the seat, biding its time. The oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiapis, is not an impressive creature. Barely a few millimeters long, with a hard, flat body and powerful legs. It cannot fly but can jump incredible distances relative to its size. And in those leaps, from rat to man, it became one of the most efficient disease vectors in history. When an infected flea bit a host bee, it a rodent, or a person, it regurgitated Yersinia pestis directly into the bloodstream, a microscopic act with world-altering consequences. And yet, medieval people knew none of this. The flea was, at best, a nuisance. It didn't draw much literary attention. People might mention itching, or scratching, or use flea combs on animals. But there was no concept of fleas carrying disease. Even the word flea rarely appears in plague era chronicles. And why would it? The illness seemed so grand, so wrathful, so cosmically ordained, that assigning blame to a bug barely visible to the naked eye felt absurd. Instead, the guilty parties were the poor, the impious, the foreign, the unlucky. Fleas. They lived in the seams of clothing, in straw bedding, in the folds of woolen cloaks. They infested rats first, but they were opportunists. When the rats began dying, the fleas had no allegiance. They jumped to cats, dogs, and people, especially people living in cramped, warm rooms. Regions where rats were less prevalent. These species, too, can transmit Y. pestis under certain conditions, but their contribution remains debated. What's not debated is the sheer density of parasitic life swarming through medieval towns. One scholar described the typical 14th century city as a tapestry of skin and itch, of fur and crawl. And in that tapestry, plague wove itself in. People did notice something. They noticed that certain environments were deadlier than others. Ships arriving from infected ports were sometimes mysteriously plague-free, not because their sailors were lucky, but because the rats and fleas had died in transit or failed to make landfall. Other ships, infested with healthy rats, sparked outbreaks as soon as they docked. Still, the logic was too murky to pin down. Without a microscope or a concept of bacteria, all they could do was watch. Curiously, the plague sometimes spared certain people or places, and this created endless speculation. Did garlic help? Was it the smoke from the firewood? No one suggested it might be the lack of fleas. And so, people repeated patterns. They burned herbs. They doused themselves in vinegar. They fled the city, sometimes unwittingly, carrying the infection with them in the folds of their cloaks. Some tried to control the rat population. Cats were encouraged in certain towns, though elsewhere they were still under suspicion of witchcraft. Traps were set, poison laid, but these were blunt tools and often inconsistent. In fact, the mass killing of cats in some plague years may have inadvertently worsened the situation, allowing rats to flourish. Bathing, as we've seen in earlier stories, was inconsistent. Public bathhouses had fallen out of favor during plague years, in part due to fears that hot water and communal spaces might spread disease. Washing one's body, one's clothes, was a luxury, not a norm. A louse-filled tunic, worn daily and never boiled, became a rolling petri dish, and the flea, it stayed right where it wanted to be. Even as monasteries aired out robes and townsfolk hung herbs from their doors, the fleas moved unseen. They hid in straw-stuffed beds, in damp floor rushes, in thatched eaves and underfloor crevices. They fed at night. They bred constantly, and once infected, they could carry Y. pestis for the rest of their short, efficient lives. By the time a household noticed symptoms, fever, vomiting, swollen buboes, it was often too late. The infected might be gone within days, and the fleas, they didn't die with their hosts. They simply moved on. And yet, despite this silent carnage, few connected the dots. The rats remained unnamed. The fleas remained invisible. The blood passed from beast to man over and over again, beneath a veil of ignorance so complete it would take centuries to lift. And that ignorance has a strange power. It allowed the flea to do what no army could: destabilize governments, shatter economies, rewrite demographics, all without a name, all without being seen. So now we must ask, was the deadliest part of the plague the parasite, or the fact that no one even knew it was there? When the final tally of the Black Death was whispered from pulpit to street corner, tens of millions dead across Europe alone, there was little energy left for understanding. The instinct was not investigation, but scapegoating. The rat, the real culprits of the catastrophe, slipped into history without ever standing trial. Their role in the story would remain buried beneath centuries of confusion, theological hand-wringing, and superstition. But the consequences of their quiet devastation would reshape the world forever. After each wave of plague, people tried to find patterns. Why did one house fall while the one next to it stood untouched? Why did whole families vanish while the innkeeper's boy survived? Why did the disease strike so quickly in cities, but so slowly in some villages? No one looked beneath the floorboards. No one peered into the seams of a tunic. Rats were common, so the explanations had to be found elsewhere. Jews were blamed, so were lepers, so were foreigners, prostitutes, beggars, and sometimes even the poor animals themselves. Cats, as mentioned earlier, were massacred by the thousands in parts of Europe, believed to be witches, familiars, or agents of the devil. In a cruel irony, the removal of cats only allowed rat populations to surge, thus worsening the spread of fleas. But humans preferred enemies they could moralize. Better to accuse a neighbor than admit that death might come from something as meaningless as a flea's choice of host. The link between rodents and disease would not begin to emerge in the Western world until the 19th century. New plagues, like the third pandemic, which began in China and spread globalist scientists in places like India, Hong Kong, and Paris, began observing the same grim choreography. Rats died first, then people. Fleas were found clustered on corpses. Dissection revealed Yersinia pestis inside the bodies of dead rodents. The microbial curtain was finally drawn back, and when it was, the entire history of the Black Death looked different. Suddenly, the overcrowded cities of medieval Europe, once viewed only as spiritually unclean, could also be understood as physically ideal for transmission. The thatched roofs, the unpaved streets, the piles of trash, the communal bedding, the stroncylated walls all made perfect nests for rats and therefore for fleas. Hygiene wasn't just moral anymore, it was microbial. And in that shift, the rat was recast from background nuisance to ecological time bomb. But even then, the picture was murkier than it first appeared. Not all plague outbreaks matched the rattan flea pattern exactly. In some places, the disease spread too quickly for flea bites to explain. Human-to-human transmission, especially through the lungs in pneumonic plague, also played a deadly role. And in some colder climates, black rats were less common. Could lice have been the true carrier there? Modern historians and epidemiologists still debate it. Some argue for a rat-heavy explanation. Others claim the plague burned so quickly in some waves that only human parasites could account for its velocity. Still others suggest that different strains of Y. pestis behaved differently. The truth, it seems, is layered. Multiple horrors. But what's certain is this: rats and fleas exploited a world humans had already dirtied. They didn't invent the filth. They didn't build the overcrowded tenements or dump rotting offal in the streets. They simply lived in the world humans made. In doing so, became death's most efficient delivery system. And yet, for centuries, rats remained largely unmentioned in art, literature, and chronicles of the plague. We remember the masks, the bonfires, the burial carts, unseen. Even today, when we say Black Death, we do not picture an infestation. We picture a priest or a corpse or a mourning family, not the real villain tucked beneath a collar. But maybe that's the lesson. that sometimes history's greatest agents of destruction are not the ones who shout or march, but the ones who crawl. And so, place and the rat disappears into the shadows. We're left with one final question. Was it the vermin that changed the world, or the blindness of the people who never thought to look for them? In the grand theater of Plague-era Europe, with its nobles and physicians, merchants and monks, there existed a cast of men who never took center stage, but without whom the performance would have swiftly drowned in its own filth. These were the nightmen, the gong farmers, the rakers, and the sweepers, the invisible backbone of medieval sanitation. If the rat and the flea were the plague's accomplices, these men were its janitors. Their job was deceptively simple: remove the waste, all of it, human and animal, bodily and otherwise. They emptied cesspits, shoveled dung from alleys, cleaned out latrines, dragged away rotting meat, lifted dead dogs from the gutter, and, in plague times, carried the bodies to. It was work that no one else wanted, but that everyone desperately needed. And in a world without sewers or organized garbage collection, gong farmers, a strange name for a truly horrible job. In this context, gong didn't mean the ringing of bells, shared public latrines. These pits were deep, often lined with bricks, and over years filled up with waste that fermented, bubbled, and rotted. To empty them, gong farmers had to climb down into the pit itself, literally descending into a stew of years-old sewage and scoop it out, bucket by bucket. The waste they removed was politely called night soil. It was loaded into barrels or carts and hauled away to be dumped in fields or special dung heaps outside the city. In some places, it was sold to farmers as fertilizer. In others, it was simply dumped into rivers or ravines. Gong farmers usually worked at night, both to avoid the disgust and stares of the public, and because the stench was a bit more bearable in the cooler hours of darkness. Their pay was relatively good, at least compared to regular laborers. But the job came with severe risks. They faced respiratory infections, skin diseases, and injuries from cave-ins or collapsing walls inside the pit. People even drowned in the sewage. Others suffocated from the toxic fumes. Some cities, eventually, passed laws requiring 2 men to enter a cesspit together, so that one could watch the other and haul him out if he passed out. Then there were the rakers, the street cleaners who scraped waste out of the gutters. Every city had a main gutter, usually running down the middle of the street, into which people dumped all kinds of filth, rotting food. Rakers worked with big wooden shovels and wore thick aprons, boots if they could afford them, and layers of cloth tied around their faces. They shoveled the waste into piles, loaded it into carts, and hauled it away, often working at night or just before dawn. During outbreaks of plague, the job expanded. Suddenly, it wasn't just trash they were clearing, it was disease. Dead animals had to be removed quickly. Clothing discarded by the sick was thought to carry deadly infection. And when corpses started appearing in the streets by families left on doorsteps, who was called the nightmen? Often the same men who worked in cesspits or alleys. The nightmen were now forced to handle the dead. They sometimes wore cloths soaked in vinegar across their mouths, if they wore anything at all. They carried long hooks or tongs, which they used to drag corpses into carts without touching them directly. In many cities, they were required to ring a bell or shout, "Bring out your dead," as they passed through the streets at dawn. In some places, they would knock once on the door of any house known to have plague victims. The bodies would be waiting. Nightmen buried the dead in mass graves, known as plague pits, long trenches, dug just outside city limits, filled layer upon layer with corpses and sprinkled with lime. They weren't professional grave diggers by trade, but they became the Moffin with no training, and rarely with any thanks. People feared and shunned them. No one wanted to speak to them, let alone touch them. Children crossed the street to avoid them. Women whispered about their smell. Some were banned from entering taverns or churches. And yet, when a city faced crisis, these men became essential. Governments passed laws to protect them. They were given access to carts, horses, gloves. They were paid extra wages. But when the outbreak ended, they were forgotten again. Few names from these professions survive in history. There are no stained glass windows dedicated to them, no poems or songs in their honor. Yet cities remained livable barely, because these men were willing to do the jobs no one else could stomach. They held back the spread of disease with shovels and buckets, vinegar and sweat, and they rarely complained. After all, nobody expected them to be clean, just invisible, gone before morning, out of sight when the sun rose and the bakers lit their ovens. But that silence leaves us with a question. Did the plague reveal the failures of medieval sanitation, or simply show that the people who kept society running were always the ones nobody wanted to see? As Europe's cities grew in the later Middle Ages, trade routes hummed with activity, and populations began recovering after the worst plague waves. Municipal leaders faced an old enemy with a new urgency: filth. Waste was no longer merely unpleasant, was a matter of life and death. So, from London to Lubeck, Paris to Prague, authorities started doing something that seemed revolutionary at the time. They began writing laws about waste. Ordinances were passed, fines were imposed, public notices were nailed to posts. But behind all these laws were the men expected to enforce them: the nightmen, the rakers, the dunkarders, the latrine diggers. And the contrast between those making the rules and those slogging through filth could not have been starker. Consider 14th century London, where the sheer number of people turned even basic waste removal into a logistical nightmare. The city council ordered every citizen to clean the street in front of their house. Gutters had to stay clear. Toilets couldn't overflow. Dead animals had to be removed within a day. But these laws were mostly symbolic, unless someone actually did the dirty work. And that someone was usually a city-employed raker. Rakers were hired through municipal contracts, often renewed each year. They were paid by the local ward or parish and given tools: long-handled shovels, wheelbarrows, carts. Their job sounded simple: patrol the streets and remove visible waste. But in practice, their routes were long, the tools were primitive, and the amount of waste was overwhelming. A single rainstorm could wash days of work right back into the streets. A festival could leave behind enough rotting food and animal guts to bury a small stable. Even worse were the cesspools, both private and public. Cities technically required homeowners to maintain their own pits, but in reality, many did not. So when pits overflowed, the gong farmers were called in. Some were licensed by the city. Others worked unofficially, picking up jobs here and there for a few pennies. If they were caught working without a license, they might be fined or simply hired anyway if no one else was available. In Paris, authorities began registering sanitation workers and required them to wear identifiable clothing or badges. In Milan, specific neighborhoods assigned a filth master to monitor waste levels and report problems. Sites usually far outside town, near rivers, or on designated dung heaps. But enforcement was inconsistent. Bribes were common, complaints were ignored, and when plague hit, the entire system fell apart. During major outbreaks, waste removal became a matter of survival. A single corpse left in a hallway could spark widespread fear. A dung heap in a market square could be blamed for dozens of deaths. So sanitation workers were drafted into plague control efforts, often without being given a choice. Their responsibilities multiplied, removing contaminated bedding, disposing of dead animals, burning infected clothing, spreading lime on doorsteps, hauling bodies from crowded buildings to mass graves. They were issued new tools hooks, vinegar-soaked cloths, sometimes even rudimentary cloth masks tied around their noses. They were ordered to follow new rules, avoid contact with the living, don't speak indoors, report any signs of sickness. But these rules were more wishful thinking than reality. A man dragging a bloated corpse down from a third-floor attic had little time for city regulations. The laws rarely protected them. In many places, sanitation workers were treated as legal nobodies. They weren't allowed to testify in court. They could be fined for entering a church. Some towns forbade them from living inside the city walls. If they had homes, they were usually built outside the gates, often right next to the waste dumps. They managed, yet their work was crucial. In plague-stricken towns, when doctors fled and priests locked their churches, it was these men who stayed. They lit the lime pits. They hauled away the dead. They shoveled out the butcher shops when even stray dogs refused to come near. And when they themselves began to die, whether from plague or sheer exhaustion, the city began to crumble. City officials took notice. Some places passed hazard pay laws for plague work. Crimes. In Florence, rakers who cleared infected waste were promised protection from the city. In Venice, special housing was built to keep workers away from the general population. But these reforms were temporary. As soon as the outbreak was over, so was the gratitude. The social stigma never disappeared. In fact, it hardened. Sanitation workers became living symbols of disease and death. Some weren't allowed to wear certain colors. Others were forced to wash in public fountains once a week of fun under supervision to make sure they actually cleaned themselves. But no law could wash away the stain of their profession in people's minds, so they lived on society's edges, recognized by their smell, paid in silence, remembered if at all as part of the background scenery, not as main characters in history. Yet, if you look closely, their presence is everywhere, in the cleared alleys, in the half-filled plague pits, in the flicker of a torch at midnight behind the baker's stall. They didn't negotiate treaties or inspire poetry, but they held the line, and that counts for something. So we must ask, if society only remembers its saviors in robes or armor, what does it mean when salvation came in the form of a man with a shovel, waist deep in a pit no one else would enter? When the last carts rolled through plague-stricken streets and the bells ceased tolling for the dead, the sanitation workers quietly returned to their normal routines, assuming they'd survived it all. The lime pits cooled, the hooks were hung back in sheds, buckets were patched. Life, in some form, resumed. But for those who had handled death every day, nothing returned to normal. Not really, in a sense. They had seen the city from the inside, out its gut, its lungs, its open wounds, while priests preached repentance and nobles fled to country estates. Many bodies a building could hide. They remembered which homes had maggots crawling out the doorways. They could still smell the rot, even after the doors were flung open and the windows scrubbed with vinegar. Yet, history, being selective, almost entirely erased them. There are almost no first-hand accounts from sanitation workers during the plague years. They were mostly illiterate. Few were considered worthy of chronicling. Their names don't appear in city records unless attached to fines or payments. We know more about the fabric used in a bishop's robe than we do about the men who cleaned up the bishop's corpse. Still, faint traces remain. Payment ledgers in medieval town archives list body haulers and night soil men receiving double wages during outbreaks. City ordinances record fines for improper waste dumping or for refusing plague assignments. Occasionally, a parish priest might write of the raker who collapsed near the lime pit or the man with the cart who never returned. These are not tributes, they are footnotes. But they are something, and yet their legacy is everywhere, even if unmarked. They helped make cities survivable, even during their most unlivable years. Their work, disgusting and dangerous, laid the groundwork for the eventual rise of modern sanitation. Long before sewers were built or public health boards established, these men functioned as the crude infrastructure of disease management. Some historians argue that their efforts, however unscientifically, saved lives. Removing corpses from homes reduced the spread of secondary infections. Hauling away waste, even imperfectly, kept pest populations in partial check. Burning contaminated linens may have stopped fleas from hopping into the next tenant's bed. These were not coordinated epidemiological strategies, but they helped in some cities. After particularly devastating plague waves, the role of sanitation was reevaluated, and waste disposal after the 1665 outbreak. In Florence, city officials created more formal oversight of waste pits and burial procedures. Even Paris made efforts, slow, scattered, but real, to enforce cleaner streets and provide for the safe disposal of refuse. These changes were not immediate. They did not abolish filth, but they marked a shift in thinking. And still, the workers themselves remained marginal. Generations of men, sometimes entire families, inherited the trades of raker, gong farmer, or corpse bearer. Some took pride in their skill. Others drank themselves into numbness. Some died young. Remains is the question of dignity. Can a profession so tied to excrement and death be remembered with honor? Should it? Modern eyes recoil at descriptions of these jobs. We imagine the stench, the grime under the fingernails, the unwashed skin. But in their time, they were as vital as any soldier or priest, perhaps more so, or command armies. But they kept the city standing when everyone else wanted to run, and yet we've built no statues to them, named no streets, taught no school children their stories. Instead, they linger in the periphery, ghosts in their own history. So, perhaps, As we look back on the Black Death and all it revealed about human fear, failure, and survival, we should pause not just to remember the kings and the martyrs, but the man with a shovel, soaked in sweat and vinegar, dragging death away before dawn. There was a time when washing your hands could raise eyebrows, that rinsing your skin too often might be cause for suspicion, that to be too clean was to be a little too proud, too foreign, or even a little unholy. Norms curdled. The act of cleaning oneself didn't always inspire admiration. In fact, it often invited doubt. Hygiene in medieval society wasn't just a matter of soap and water. It was bound tightly to theology, social class, superstition, and fear. People understood the importance of physical cleanliness, but not in a microbial sense. Instead, cleanliness was often interpreted symbolically. A clean person might be seen as morally upright, or too vain, or trying to hide something. It all depended on who you were, where you were, and, crucially, how often you reached for the water basin. To begin, let's clarify a widespread misconception. People in medieval Europe didn't completely avoid bathing. In fact, many cities had public bathhouses, and wealthy households often included private washrooms, or at least tubs. But after the Black Death struck, attitudes began to shift. Bath places of warmth, relaxation, and sometimes body socializing became suspect. They were warm, moist, crowded, perfect for spreading disease, though no one yet understood why. Instead of recognizing the role of contagion or vectors, authorities pointed fingers at the moral risks of bathing. It was said to open the pores, both literally and metaphorically, to sin. By the 15th century, in many Christian towns, public bathing was frowned upon. In some places, it was outright banned during times of plague. To bathe too frequently became not just unwise, became unseemly, and so personal hygiene routines grew more limited. A scented powder brushed into the hair, but immersion, scrubbing, frequent hand-washing, these were uncommon, especially among the poor and increasingly associated with outsiders. Nowhere was this more evident than in the quiet tension between. In Islamic culture, ritual washing wudu was a daily, structured act. Hands, feet, face, and mouth were washed before prayer. Hygiene was considered a form of spiritual discipline. Similarly, Jewish law placed emphasis on cleanliness, both ritual and practical. Hand-washing before meals, after bodily functions, and on entering the home was not just normal, it was expected. To Christians unfamiliar with these rituals, especially in plague-terrified Europe, such practices could appear suspicious. Why? Were these people always washing? What were they washing away? Was it poison? Sorcery? Were they immune to the plague because of their strange habits, or were they causing it? In several cities, Jewish communities were blamed for outbreaks of plague and massacred en masse. One reason cited, that they seemed to get sick less often because they bathed more. Their cleaner hands and more frequent laundering were interpreted not as foresight or religious obedience, but as evidence of conspiracy. Even within Christian communities, excessive hygiene could be misunderstood. A well-scrubbed servant girl might be accused of vanity. A merchant who insisted on clean hands before meals could be mocked as fussy or foreign. Soap was available, mostly made from animal fat and lye, but it wasn't something used casually or frequently. To use it often was to signal status, affectation, or foreignness. and those were not always safe signals to send. The irony, of course, is sharp. Clothes, maintaining personal cleanliness were often discouraged or mocked. Instead, people clung to protective charms, perfumes, and religious tokens. They hung herbs in doorways and carried pomanders. Touched, carried, and buried went largely unwashed. There were exceptions. Some monasteries kept stricter hygiene standards, especially those influenced by older Roman traditions. Physicians, those who could afford it, might wash before treating patients. A few forward-thinking city councils even encouraged street cleaning, but these were the outliers. For most, cleanliness was not a defense against disease. It was, at best, a luxury, at worst, a sign of pride or suspicion. So in this muddled landscape of fear and filth, they invited stares. They whispered of foreign ways. They seemed untouched by the suffering around the man that more than anything could mark them as dangerous. Which leaves us with a curious question. In a world dying from the invisible, why did the visible act of washing provoke so much fear? In the minds of many in Plague-era Europe, the idea that water could be both cleansing and contaminating was not contradictory, it was practically doctrine. Cold water, especially, was feared. It was thought to weaken the body, open the pores, allow vapors, miasmas, or even spirits to seep inside. This belief, paired with a growing suspicion of bathing culture, helped solidify the notion that cleanliness itself might not be safe. And so the grim paradox of medieval hygiene deepened. Washing might purify the soul, but it could also poison the body. This wasn't just superstition, it was medical theory. The most widely accepted health model of the time was based on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease was thought to result from imbalance between these fluids. Bathing, especially immersion in water, was believed to weaken the body's natural defenses, unbalancing the humors. Open pores were a danger. The body, when warm and wet, was seen as vulnerable to outside forces, diseased air, spiritual corruption, or the chill of death. Even physicians advised caution. Medical manuals warned against frequent baths and recommended instead the use of dry cloths, perfumes, and powders. Water might be reserved for the sick, the rich, or the exceptionally devout. But even then, bathing had to be tightly controlled. Lukewarm at most, short in duration, performed only when the humors allowed. And so, hand-washing, something so basic and instinctual to modern health, became a ritual only loosely tethered to hygiene. In many homes, there was no fixed place to wash hands. People might wipe them on aprons or cloths. Meals were often eaten with fingers, and etiquette books emphasized when not to touch others more than how to keep oneself clean. For the poor, soap was expensive, and water had to be fetched. A bucket of clean water was valuable. It wasn't squandered on idle rinsing. Meanwhile, in religious and scholarly communities, especially those with contact across the Mediterranean, another understanding was quietly flourishing. In Muslim cities like Cairo and Cordoba, hand-washing before prayer, after meals, and during illness was codified, not questioned. Water was central to spiritual life, and cleanliness was inseparable from devotion. In Jewish homes across Europe, the practice of netlat yadim, or ritual hand-washing, was performed each morning and before eating bread. This wasn't just piety, it was public health. centuries ahead of its time. But in Christian Europe, these practices remained culturally foreign. And in times of plague, foreignness became danger. In places like Strasbourg, Cologne, and Basel, Jewish communities were slaughtered after being accused of poisoning wells accusanis, fueled, in part, by the visible cleanliness of their rituals. The irony, of course, was devastating. The very communities most attuned to hygiene were accused of spreading disease, precisely because they weren't getting sick as often. Even within Christian enclaves, those who adhered to stricter hygiene were sometimes singled out. Merchants returning from the East, having adopted hand-washing or perfumed oils, might be accused of sorcery or unnatural practices. Women who laundered clothes too frequently, especially during plague years, were gossiped about, as if cleanliness could only mean they were trying to hide something.